Welcome back to the Sunday Long Read podcast. My name's Amanda Ulrich. I'm a journalist and college professor based in California, and today we're diving into a new episode of our Behind the Stories series. In this series, we highlight some of our favorite long-form stories, which could be about any topic, and talk directly with the journalists who wrote those pieces. This week, I'm very excited to be speaking with Jessica Sidman, a food editor at the Washingtonian magazine in Washington, D.C. Jessica's written about food and politics and the D.C. restaurant scene for many years, but she wrote one story in particular a few weeks ago that caught her eye, especially with the election coming up so quickly. It's a piece called "What's the Deal with Republicans and Steakhouses?" In this story, Jessica tries to get to the bottom of why Republican politicians love to eat at a few particular steakhouses in D.C., and what that food choice might say about our political landscape more broadly. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So I guess just to start off, it probably makes sense to, you wrote this article for the Washingtonian about kind of steakhouses in DC, and these are the spots that Republicans tend to frequent. And then you actually spent a night there with a Republican lobbyist. Can you kind of,
Yes,
right off the bat, tell us what your impressions were that night? What was the scene like?
Well, I've been saying that it's the most Washington night in my entire life in Washington. Capitol Grill is one of the most Republican hangouts in DC right now. So I knew I wanted to go there with a Republican lobbyist who knew, members of Congress and other politicos, and could help me spot people and, introduce me to this world. And it was kind of everything I hoped and imagined it would be. I think I met like 10 members of Congress in one night and ate a juicy ribeye and drank wine and saw all this lobbyist schmoozing. And it was right out of a movie scene almost.
It sounds like it. I also love the line you wrote where you said, if Washington is the swamp, then its steakhouses are the alligator pits. I felt like that was a great description. I mean, can you kind of describe what typically goes down in these steakhouses on any given night? I guess it seems like real conversations are being had about kind of high stake issues.
Yeah, I think, DC in particular has long been known as the steakhouse town. And many of the prominent ones are located in the corridors of power, right near the Capitol, near the White House. So naturally, you have a lot of people from different administrations and Congress going to these places. In DC, the VIPs tend to be the politicians, right? And steakhouses in particular have become very Republican coded over the years. So, these are places where there are a lot of fundraisers. There are meetings, so sometimes they're bipartisan meetings. There's a lot of lobbyist actions. These are just magnets for lobbyists. So many lobbyists just hanging out there, just hoping to, catch a senator's eye and, maybe get a word in. And that's, a call back to their client to say, oh, hey, I saw so-and-so. So yeah, it's a lot of it's one of the back rooms of Washington.
Definitely. And it really does seem like now there is that political divide within DC steakhouses with, I think you said, Republican PACs outspending Democrats 13-1 with, I think it was almost $800,000 worth of bills this election cycle. But it also sounds like it wasn't always so divided. There wasn't always that deep partisan line in steakhouses. Can you kind of talk about that history, when this became such a Republican politician breeding ground or place to meet?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Steakhouses really came into prominence in DC in the early 20th century. And, they've always been associated with power and, masculinity. But, according to the historians that I've talked to, they weren't particularly partisan. You saw people from both sides of the aisle. And I think that has started to shift in recent decades, kind of with the way politics themselves have becoming more divisive. And when you think about it, steakhouses really represent a lot of what the Republican Party wants to represent these days. There's the pure geographic part of it where, steak or cows are raised in typically more red states. But also there are all these other layers of and values of tradition and masculinity. And, you've seen people like Trump, who is a well-known, well-done steak lover, saying, Kamala's coming for your beef. She doesn't want you to eat your red meat. And it's kind of become this part of the culture wars as well.
Do you think the fact that, and I know you've noted in a lot of your articles that Trump only visited when he was in office one restaurant in DC, and that was the steakhouse in his own hotel. Do you think that contributed to the Republican steakhouse combo, or do you think it was kind of already starting to become a trend before that?
Yeah, I think it was already a little bit starting to become a trend in years prior. Capitol Grill, which I write a lot about in the story, it opened the DC location in the same year that the Republicans took power of the House and Senate for the first time in 40 years. And Newt Gingrich, who was the new Speaker of the House, right around this time of the opening, made that his regular spot, and it kind of established that place as a Republican hangout. But then certainly there has never been a place that seemed as partisan as the Trump Hotel and the steakhouse there. That was the MAGA hub during the Trump years. You could go there pretty much any night of the week and you might spot a cabinet secretary or White House official or, whatever prominent figures in the party hanging out there. And of course, as you mentioned, Trump himself, that was the only restaurant he ever visited while he was in office.
So when he was in office, would you say that the Trump Hotel was more prominent for Republican politicians than Capitol Grill was?
Yeah, I think that was pretty well known place. It was always, in the headlines of who was being spotted there. Capitol Grill to me is a little more under the radar, and it's more of the, it's more of a congressional hangout because it's closer to the Capitol, and your chiefs of staff and figures like that. Whereas the Trump Hotel was really revolved around Trump.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so I feel like the logical question is, if Republicans in DC have steakhouses, then where do Democrats go? Is there as common of a place, a place that everyone agrees on is the go-to spot, or is it less clear on that side?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it was one that I was trying to ask people about. I don't think it's as easy to pinpoint. It's not like a specific cuisine or a specific place. I think in general, Democrats do tend to gravitate toward the newer, trendier places. And, especially when it comes to PAC spending, you see Democrats being a little more conscious of what kind of message it's sending when they visit a place and spend money at a place. So making a conscious effort to spend money at maybe a Black-owned restaurant or an immigrant-owned restaurant or a woman-owned restaurant and things of that nature.
It's interesting that it seems like optics to the voter are coming into play more on that side versus Republicans. I mean, I guess either way, it's optics, which I know you talk about in your story about how this is all sending messages about, what that party, what that person represents.
Yeah, well, even with the steakhouses, I think a lot of I was kind of worried when I started this story if I was going to be able to get a lot of Republicans to talk about how much they love steakhouses, and it turns out they love to talk about it. They were thrilled to talk about it, because it does send a certain message, to their own constituents, and in a lot of ways, the steakhouse is very America first, right? It's Americana at its core. Although, as I write in the story, never mind if the valets and the cooks are immigrants, but it does represent a lot of their values as well.
For sure. Do you think there's a similar divide when it comes to drinks in DC? Is there a specific
Ooh.
Republican drink, Democrat drink, or specific bars that are as partisan that you've seen, similar to restaurants?
Yeah, I don't think quite as much. Over time, there have been some places. There was a bar called the Big Board in DC that was that flaunted the mask and vaccine mandates that DC had during the pandemic, and so it got a lot of attention from prominent Republicans who were, making an effort to go there and talk about it. But for the most part, I would say the DC scene as a whole, you're going to see Republicans and Democrats at all kinds of places. There are only, a few pockets where it does start to feel partisan.
And I saw your article that was listing the different election-themed pop-up bars. But it seems like that's more catered, of course, not to politicians, to people who are looking to take a selfie or go to a themed bar before the election. But that is an interesting trend that those seem to have.
Yeah, we love our politically themed cocktails here in DC. And it's kind of amazing, anytime there's a major news headline, Trump is indicted, Joe Biden drops out of the race, Kamala Harris enters the race. Within an hour, somebody has a themed drink special ready to go. And that's just a very classic DC thing. The debate watch parties here are just insane. It's like the Super Bowl. People get so excited about it. And I'm not sure that's quite the same everywhere else in the country.
I definitely don't think it is. You touched on this, but why? I mean, of course, the DC restaurant food scene is so intrinsically linked with politics, but can you kind of talk about why, kind of the deeper meaning of that, and why, beyond just the fact that Republicans like steakhouses and like steak, and you talk about this in your article, but why that's important, how politics and food are combined, and why it's important that the choice of food that politicians choose to eat speaks to their broader politics.
Yeah, I mean, this is a company town, and the company is the government. And so, a lot of people, even if they don't work for the federal government, they have jobs that rely on it or are tangential to it. And it's just, a population of people that, for the most part, do pay attention to the politics and the election. And as I was mentioning, the politicians are often the VIPs at the restaurants. I think where they go can be very telling. And there's certainly a lot of interest when, the president or vice president eats around town, and what does it mean? And people are saying, Tim Walz spotted at Old Abbott Grill and stuff like that. That's something that people here like to follow, and just dissect what our local celebrities like to eat. I remember one story where Joe and Jill Biden went to eat at an Italian restaurant, and they both ordered the same pasta dish. And people were just going crazy online discussing the idea of like them getting the same dish, versus getting other dishes that they could share, So, maybe in LA they care about what Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt or whatever are eating, but here we care about Jill and Joe Biden.
I actually didn't. I didn't think about that piece of it. I was thinking about the messaging of food and what food you eat, but also, of course, it's the humanization of, with that example, you're like, oh, they're just like us. What would I order at this restaurant? Do you think that's part of it? Is people are interested in that because it's, it's something that all of us have to do. We all have to eat all day long. It's something that's like ties us to these larger than life people.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing I love about being a food writer specifically is that it does touch on all these different areas. My beat isn't just food; it's economics, it's business, it's culture, it's art, it's crime. Sometimes it's politics. And so, it's something that everyone can relate to and touches on many different aspects of our lives.
Hello, I'm Albert Samaha. I'm an award-winning journalist at the Washington Post, author most recently of the book Concepcion, and the guest editor of the Sunday Long Reads True Crime Spotlight newsletter. Check out our monthly newsletter, where I'm curating the best true crime stories, from thrilling narratives through little-known underworlds to investigations that expose corporate or police misconduct. You can subscribe at sundaylongread.com/truecrime. That's sundaylongread.com/truecrime. Hope you'll join us. Peace.
And so, of course, when he was in office, Trump only visited the one steakhouse in his own hotel. But then recently, he visited a Vietnamese restaurant in Falls Church, Virginia, right? But didn't eat anything. What do you think that message was there?
So, yes, for people who aren't from this area, that was a real shocker. It's in this shopping center that's heavily Vietnamese, lots of Vietnamese restaurants and Vietnamese culture. And this particular restaurant is really like hidden in this mall, very much a hidden gem. You got to be in the know kind of place in a lot of ways. And honestly, when I first saw the photo of Trump there, I thought it was photoshopped because it made no sense to me. But, actually, it does make a lot of sense because he does have some support in the Vietnamese community. And he was there with a candidate who's running for a Virginia office who is Vietnamese. And so I think, it was probably their idea to make a stop at that restaurant. And as far as I'm aware, he did not actually eat anything there. So I'm not sure it's that he went there and he talked, but I don't believe he actually ate any of the food.
That's very funny. So it's more about the overall optics than really digging into Vietnamese cuisine.
Exactly.
Well, of course, you've been covering this, but while Biden has been in office, what have his go-to spots been? It seems like he's kind of gone to the classic D.C. Established places. But what do you think his go-to spots say about how he's hoping to come across? Or,
yeah, that's a good question. I think that they do reveal he's a little bit of a creature of Washington because the places that he's visited for the most part have been kind of the stereotypical Washington power restaurants, places like Le Diplomat and Cafe Milano. Um, I think on occasion he's ventured out to, like a taqueria to, um, I think part of it was for the COVID relief, some of the COVID relief legislation, um, or, to make a certain point, political point. But when it's just him eating out, he tends to stick to the very traditional places in DC.
It's interesting, too, that it's very telling his choices versus Trump's in their experience in DC, because, of course, Biden has this long tenure in politics being in DC. So he's, going to these established spots. And then Trump, doesn't have that background. So he's, sticking to what he knows, to what he's familiar with.
Right. And I think, Trump wants to go where he's going to find an adoring crowd, right? And he knew that if he went to his own hotel, obviously people are going to stand up and applaud when he walks into the steakhouse there. DC is a very blue city. So if he did that in pretty much any other restaurant, people would not be giving him that reception, to put it lightly.
Right. And I think you maybe touched on this, but the idea of bump to restaurants when big name politicians visit. I think you mentioned the Obama bump phenomenon. Whenever he would visit a restaurant in DC when he was in office, that would, create a lot of buzz and people would flock to those restaurants. So is that, say, the ultimate goal for restaurant owners in DC, that a big name politician will show up?
I think it depends who it is, right? And the Obamas, certainly had a lot of star power when they came to office, and the Obama administration just happened to coincide with this real boom in the DC food scene. So when he and Michelle would go out for date night, there was a lot of excitement about it, and people would want to go to that restaurant afterwards, and the businesses would see a big spike in traffic and sales in the weeks afterward. That was not true for Trump, and I don't really think that's true for Biden, just given I don't know that there's quite that same star wattage for Biden and the kind of places that he's going. But I do see, if Kamala Harris becomes president, she is someone who is also a real foodie. And I can see a similar Harris bump potentially if she's eating around town as president.
I was actually going to specifically ask you about that. Do you think that's something that restaurant owners are thinking will happen, that she will kind of venture out because she's someone who's just, fashioned herself as a foodie and a good cook? Is that something that DC is thinking might happen if she's elected?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of excitement for that idea. And even when Biden came into office, I wrote this story about, restaurant owners kind of trying to work their back channels to get a visit from Biden, because I think after the Trump years, they were kind of starved for that kind of attention, right? It is exciting for a lot of restaurants here to get that kind of a high profile visit, and the Secret Service, and there's a lot of attention to the restaurant, so it can be good for business. Again, it depends on who the politician is, and I can see a similar thing happening for Harris, where a lot of restaurant owners will be, schmoozing their connections to get her in their door.
Definitely. Do you see in this short amount of time that we have left before the election, do you see any strategic campaign stops at future DC restaurants, whether from Harris or from Trump? Do you foresee more stops in Trump's future, like the Vietnamese restaurant?
Well, I don't. I think the thing with them coming to DC is, this is the swamp, right? So it's not necessarily always a great idea for politicians to be seen out and about in DC, especially at like a fancy restaurant. So I don't know that there are a lot of places where it would be like, leading up to the election, especially because, DC isn't a swing state by any means. I don't think there are going to be any strategic, photo ops at restaurants here specifically. But, you might see, I'm sure you'll see them at other donut shops and taco stands and what have you, and other parts of the country in swing states.
Right. Yeah, definitely. What's your take on campaigning, obviously outside of DC, and the choice of food for politicians there? Have you seen a common choice of type of shop or restaurant for Republican politicians to visit versus Democrats, or do you think it tends to lean small business, kind of like Americana?
Yeah. I don't know that there's anything specific to cuisine, but obviously both candidates want to show their support from small businesses, and the restaurant industry is a huge part of that. A huge job creator, and a huge part of this election. So, it's an important stop for them on both parties, no matter, what kind of restaurant it is, but probably more the mom and pops than the big chains for the most part. Although I saw Trump is going to be working the fryer at McDonald's, apparently.
Wow. Yeah. Very interesting. When is that happening?
I don't know. Now that one you might want to look into a little further before you add that in.
Do you think there's a specific type of Pennsylvania food that will be a focus in the next few weeks? If you could look into the future, do you foresee that possibility?
Oh gosh, I don't. I'm not as familiar with Pennsylvania specific regional foods, so I can't say for sure. But probably.
How would you say in general politics and politicians have shaped this is a very broad question, but shaped the DC food scene in a way that, somewhere like New York doesn't have that influence? Do you kind of think that every city has a central type of influence on its food scene, and you can see that impact?
Yeah, well, I think, one of the reasons why, steakhouses, for example, have persisted all these years, and other, similar types of restaurants, is because they are great for things like fundraising and events, which is a huge part of Washington culture in DC. And, so much money in politics is raised at places like that. And also, you have people who fly into DC to meet with their members of Congress, and they'll go to restaurants like that, and places where there's a little bit of something for everyone that's going to appeal to people from all parts of America. Again, those are places that you tend to find, around the Capitol, around the White House. But also, I do want to just say that DC has an amazingly diverse food scene. We have, amazing Ethiopian food, Salvadoran food, Korean. This is also very international city. And we have Michelin restaurants, high-end restaurants. Like, it's not all those, cookie cutter steakhouses, although those have their place as well.
What, no matter what happens in the election, what do you see happening at Capitol Grill and other steakhouses? I guess, will the tone of who wins the election impact business there? Or do you think that at this point it's an establishment and it's probably going to continue to be successful among Republicans?
Yeah, I think it's Capitol Grill specifically, that's a Washington establishment. And, one of the Republican lobbyists in my story, he said, basically, it's like the Washington Monument, you just know it's always there. It's an institution in its own way. And so, whether, it might get a bump if there are more Republicans in town, but it will probably thrive just as well if, Democrats take over, and, maybe that's more of the safe space for them. So, these places survive administration after administration, Republican or Democrat. It doesn't really matter.
Definitely. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Is there anything that I have forgotten to ask you or that you want to add, either about the food scene in DC or, how it relates to the upcoming election? Anything major that we haven't talked about?
I think we covered it pretty well. Yeah. So hopefully this was helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think it's fascinating to be, I think that for a lot of people, politics can feel kind of removed from their daily lives. And I think it's always interesting for people to think about what food politicians are eating and what that says about how they're hoping to come across and their messaging. So I think this is kind of a relatable thing for people who may not always dive into the nuts and bolts of policy and politics.
Right. Yeah, I think definitely like what's unique about living here is, you might go to a Pilates class and see a member of Congress, or, just be in your neighborhood coffee shop and see a senator or, a White House official, and they're just people who live here. And so, like as a journalist in DC, that's also, we try to really cover official Washington meets hometown DC, and restaurants are a big place where that happens.
Definitely. This episode of the Sunday Long Read podcast was produced by Matthew Whitehurst and me, Amanda Ulrich. The co-founders of the Sunday Long Read newsletter are Jacob Feldman and Don Van Natta Jr. If you like this episode, you can support us by following the Sunday Long Read on your favorite platform, and make sure to check out our newsletter if you haven't already. You can subscribe at sundaylongread.com/subscribe. Until next time, thanks for listening.